Good afternoon. This past weekend we celebrated Memorial Day when we remember the many men and women in our armed services who made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. And perhaps we might even have thought about some people we knew in our families or among our acquaintances who did that for us. Or perhaps we even thought about some of the great admirals and generals who have served our country. But I want to talk about the greatest general that ever lived. Mark Twain was so impressed by this general that he spent 12 years in research before writing about this general, whom he thought to be the greatest person who ever lived. It's not about General George Washington or Robert E. Lee or General Grant or General Patton or General Eisenhower. This general was a little French general. But no, it wasn't Napoleon Bonaparte. This general's name is Joan d'Arc. We know her better as Joan of Arc. Born in the year 1412 in Domremy in Lorraine, which is eastern France, her early years were quite ordinary. But at the age of 13, she began to hear heavenly voices. St. Michael the Archangel, St. Catherine of Alexandria, St. Margaret of Antioch. And these voices revealed that her mission in life was to liberate the French kingdom from English control. You see, Joan lived right in the middle of the 100 Years' War between England and France was in terrible, terrible shape. The entire country, with the exception of some land in the southwest, was in control of the English. The country's treasury was bankrupt, her soldiers disheartened and dispersed, all courage dead in the hearts of the people through long years of foreign and domestic oppression, and the king, afraid, resigned to defeat and ready to flee the country. And then along comes Joan, a little peasant girl of 17. She had been nowhere and seen nothing. She knew none but simple shepherd folk. She had never seen anyone important. She hardly knew what a soldier looked like. She had never ridden a horse, nor she held a warlike weapon in her hand. And she could neither read nor write. She could spin and sew, knew her catechism and prayers, and was very devout to the sacraments, and she knew the history of the church. But that was all her learning. Nevertheless, at the age of 17, prompted by her heavenly voices, Joan left her home, got an escort from the captain of Vaucouleurs, a neighboring town, who had remained faithful to the King of France, and disguised as a boy, rode through the English territory to meet the King of France. When she arrived at his court, there was a man sitting on a throne, dressed in royal splendid robes, but Joan did not go up to him. She looked around and looked around and looked around, and then finally she came to a man who looked very much like everybody else in the room, and she fell to her feet because that was the king. And her voices had revealed that to Joan. Well, the king was not exactly sure what to do, so he had her examined by some theologians for 3 weeks at Poitiers. And afterwards the king agreed to follow her advice and reassembled her army, his army. Joan was made the commander-in-chief with a prince of the royal house and the veteran generals of France as her subordinates. And at the head of the first army she had ever seen, she marched to Orleans, or as the French say, Orléans, overcame the commanding fortresses of the enemy in 3 desperate attacks, and in 8 days repelled the attack of the English, which had defied the might of France for 8 months, and freed the city of Orleans. After a tiresome delay caused by the vacillation of the king and the bad advice of his ministers, Joan finally received permission to take the field again. And she won victory after victory after victory and broke the back of the 100 Years' War. And finally, on July 17th, 1429, just 2 months after taking command, she fulfilled her prophecy of liberating France and having the king crowned at the great cathedral of Reims. And on that day, Joan herself placed the crown on the head of Charles VII. Unfortunately, the weak-willed king opposed Joan's further plans to capture Paris, and he disbanded the army. And for the next 8 months, there was nothing for Joan to do. Occasionally, she would gather a troop of cavalry and engage the English in a minor battle. And one such effort occurred at the end of the year 1430, where the city of Compiègne was under attack from the Duke of Burgundy. And when her attack on the Duke's fortresses failed, Joan found herself the Duke of Burgundy's prisoner. She was held for ransom, but for some unknown reason, the king and the people of France offered not 1 penny. Finally, 7 months later, she was sold to the English, where she was put on trial for heresy because the English wanted to get rid of a dangerous opponent and discredit the French king who owed her his crown. But they couldn't trick her, they couldn't trap her, they couldn't prove any of the charges against her, and how wonderful were her answers that she gave when she was examined by the trial prosecutors. She diffused the charges and parried the thrusts made against her, answering every question with wisdom that sometimes embarrassed her intercessors. At one point she was asked, "Joan, are you in the state of grace or not?" Well, to say she was, that would be presumptuous because nobody knows. And if she was going to be humble and say no, then that would prove that she was a witch, that she was a heretic. And this was her answer: "If I am, I pray that I will soon be in the grace of God. If I am not, I pray that he will soon, if I am, I pray that he will keep me there." Nevertheless, she was condemned. But this was a hollow victory for her enemies, as she had confessed no wrongdoing, and none of the charges had really been proved. So the bishop in charge of the trial persuaded her to sign what was deemed an unimportant paper, and at the last minute he switched papers and substituted one in which Joan admitted all the charges she had denied throughout the trial. Shortly afterwards, on May the 30th, 1431, Joan was burned at the stake. As she was being burned, one of the soldiers cried out, "We are lost because we have burned a saint." You know, when we reflect on her century, with perhaps one of the most brutal, wickedest, and rottenest in history since the Dark Ages, we have to wonder how Joan came out of such a climate. The contrast between her and her century is like night and day. She was truthful when lying was the common speech. She was a keeper of promises when others immediately forgot theirs. She gave her mind to great thoughts and purposes when other minds wasted themselves upon petty ambitions. She had convictions in a time when men believed in nothing and doubted everything. She was spotlessly pure in mind and body when society in the highest places was foul and rotten in both. What made Joan so remarkable was the grace of God. Nobody could naturally acquire all those virtues and talents without God's grace. Many young people have done amazing things, but they all had some training before their accomplishments. You think about Mozart, you think about Alexander the Great, you think of all kinds of remarkable people through history. But Joan had none of those advantages. She simply had the grace of God. But God's grace was enough to make her greater than Mozart and Alexander and anybody else who has ever lived. When interviewed a number of years later about his greatest book, the one in which he took most pride in, Mark Twain didn't say Huckleberry Finn or Tom Sawyer or The Prince and the Pauper or Innocents Abroad or Life on the Mississippi. He said it was Joan of Arc. May we allow the grace of God to penetrate our hearts, to make us maybe not great in the eyes of the world, but great in the eyes of God.